to use the same method of marginalism to find what we are going to call marginal time preference. And this is a phrase which Mises never used, not even by accident, because he was quite sure that his approach, originary interest, and the taking what I would call averaging would give you the marginal preference. So we can assume without much more ado that there is such a thing as time preference. We don't have to refine the idea, give reference to marginalism. That's what Mises did. But I think, no, it's necessary to say the time preference of whom? And the answer is the time preference of the marginal saver. But in practice, the marginal saver is going to be a bondholder. Wasn't always that way, because we just mentioned a previous session that during the Middle Ages, even earlier in pagan times, but Middle Ages, early Renaissance, just before the Protestant religion started to take hold on people's thinking in Europe, there was a proscription against lending and borrowing virtually. Well, actually proscription was against interest, but nobody would lend without some consideration, some incentive. But the point is that it had to be a free bond market. Marketable bonds, that's, you see, this is something important. You have to say marketable bonds, because a bond, you say in London, a handshake, blah, 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 it's a bond. Yeah, but it may not be marketable, and a large part of the US debt is non-marketable. But we are definitely concentrating on marketable debt, on marketable bonds. So this was made possible by this movement, started with the spread of the Protestant religion, especially John Calvin, and it culminated in free bond market, and it grew, and it grew, and it reached the point that practically 95% of all lending and borrowing is channeled through the marketable bond market. And in that situation, we can see it perfectly how the method of marginals works, because we rank people according to their time preference, which can be expressed with a number, and the number is that particular interest rate which they still find acceptable, but anything lower than that they will find unacceptable and rejected. So if they are bondholders, they will sell their bond at the moment the interest rate drops below their time preference rate. So we have ranked people, and again we look at the cutoff point, and that's the marginal subject, and the marginal subject is could be called a marginal bondholder. He is the one who is going to sell his bond once the interest rate is pushed below his marginal time preference rate. And this is something which has teeth it has golden teeth, and it bites. It hurts the banks, and it hurts the government too, under the gold standard, if the marginal bondholder exercises his right and privilege and sells the bond, and keep the proceeds in the gold coin of the realm. He's not going to accept gold certificates. It's got to be the gold coin. If he accepted the gold certificate, in the US they called it the yellow back, as opposed to the green back. The yellow back gold certificate, the Treasury promised to pay bearer on demand gold coin, usually the $20 gold eagle coin. And if the marginal bondholder accepted the gold certificate, as Mises suggested that he would, then he would act counterproductive to his interest, because he would give up the bond, which still paid an interest, however low, but it was a positive interest, and exchanged it with a piece of paper, the yellow back, which paid zero interest. So that would be like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So using his reason, the marginal bondholder would not consider anything but gold, and he would keep his savings in gold. And if the banks once more allowed the rate of interest to come back and reach his the level of his marginal time preference, then he would buy back the gold bond. And this meant that he would make a profit. He sold the gold bond high, and now he buys it back low. So the difference is his profits. And this profit, which the marginal bondholder can make, is the guarantee that the system is going to work. So again, what I'm emphasizing here is the ranking and the marginal subject. So same idea. You see, we are looking for a generalized method, which is applicable in very, very different situations. Now, I just wonder how we are with time. It's
we have 25 more minutes.
Yeah, so there's still more time. I don't mind if we have a discussion during this period rather than in the afternoon. So if you want to ask questions when I finish, I will welcome your questions. Now the concept of marginal utility was the first in this various applications, and a very important application it is because it gave rise to the concept of marketability, Menger's original idea. And we have another lecture coming up which is devoted entirely to this, but I want to emphasize right here that this is important because it leads to the idea of the most marketable commodity. And as you know, we are going to refine that and talk about marketability in the small, marketability in the large. But for us, the important thing is that there will be a most marketable good. You ask me what my definition of money would be. And my answer was, well, it's simply the most marketable good. So that assumes this method of marginalism, introducing the concept of marginal utility. Through it, we talk about the marketability of a good, which we measure as through the spread. The spread is the difference between the
bid and offer.
Yes,
the price at which.
So, which is the higher?
The offer.
The offer is the higher, and we subtract the bid. That's the bid-ask spread, and that is a function of quantity. Depends. For lower quantity, it could be larger, yeah. And smaller quantity could be the other way around.
Sorry. Well, you have the range, don't you?
Yeah, the spread.
Yeah.
Let's draw a diagram.
So,
two curves, one for the bid and the other for the offer. Asked price and offer price are the same. In Britain, apparently, they prefer the offer. In the United States, the asked price. So, where is the spread?
The spread is the difference between the two.
So
this is quantity, sorry. I didn't put here. Quantity and exchange value or price.
So, okay, now, you were right, because as we start at that point, okay, somewhere there, okay, so there is the spread, just draw the spread, and keep moving it to the right, you will see that it is increasing. Now, this is very easy to understand. How would you explain why this happens? Why is the spread widening when greater quantity is exchanged?
Shall I?
Yeah.
I mean, you're dipping into the pool of what's available at this end of the curve, and you're dealing in unmarketable.
You sell, you take a risk, because you have to replenish your inventory. I mean, you are a tradesman. You are not sitting a pile just for the sake of sitting. You are making a market. So if somebody, a very unusually large order comes in, you have to think, can I fill it at the usual spread? And say, no, because I'm not 100% sure I can replenish my inventory. So he will quote, because of this added risk, he will quote a higher spread. Yeah, we are talking about marketability. This variation of the spread describes the concept of marketability. If we want to compare one commodity, call it A, with another commodity, call it B, and want to decide which is more marketable than the other. Is it A which is more marketable than B? or vice versa. The answer is going to be, you look at the spread, and both spreads will increase. And the commodity which is more marketable than the other will have which spread? The spread which increases less, more slowly than the other. Is that clear, or does it call for more explanation? Louis, somebody says, oh, well, I don't quite understand. How would you make it more understandable?
How would I? I guess the community of interested buyers and sellers is abundant, and therefore the meeting point between the two collective is close, as opposed to being far.
Marketability is an idea, how easy it is, or how can you do the exchange with as little loss as possible. Now, a wider spread always implies a possibility of a greater loss than a smaller. So the same way, if the spread increasing more slowly than for another commodity, this means the losses involved in the exchange will be smaller. And that is the same idea as marketability. Right?
Less unknown, less uncertainty.
Less uncertainty, but more concretely, uncertainty is abstract, but loss is very, very concrete. Okay? So the effort to get away with the least possible loss implies greater marketability. And ultimately, of course, there will be a top gun, that's the most marketable good, which is going to be money.
Well, I would just suggest that even the optimum point would be higher to begin with. So if you turn around with the best quantity of silver and you buy and sell, the premium is going to hurt more than gold. So gold is smaller spread to start with, and it also happens less. I mean, if you buy a new car and you turn around and sell it immediately, you took 20% loss.
You are going to lose. There's loss involved.
So there's a loss there, but it's minimum, and it grows the least also.
All right? So this is again the marginal utility, which blossoms into this theory of marketability. It's pure Menger, 100% Menger. Very beautiful idea, and we should keep it in mind. And now I did promise something, and I'm not trying to remember that I will point out something. Well, it will come back. So. So it so happened that gold, after a long evolution, taking probably thousands of years, and not just hundreds, but thousands, because it goes way before writing was invented. No written records existed how this started, but it was a snowballing effect. Marketability of gold grew and grew and grew. So it's the experience, not just those of us who are still living, but also those who have deceased, dead people, because their experience was that the most marketable good is going to give you that superb confidence that it will keep its value. So they would rather choose gold than say platinum if it had been invented already, because the amount of gold is so much greater above ground than the amount of platinum. So this has been through thick and thin, the gold, and it kept increasing, and that reflects that supreme confidence. And the gold came out on the top. Okay. Now, I make a reference here to Adam Smith, who is really a hero for us, not so much for the mainstream Austrians. They don't like Adam Smith. They look at him as you would look at a poor relative. I mean, you have to admit that he's a relative, but you are not too happy when they remind you that you have this relative. And Adam Smith, basically because of he fathered the real Bill's doctrine, and that's an unforgivable sin. But that's another subject. We are talking about a mistake of Adam Smith. He's our hero, no question about that, but he did make that mistake. He adopted the labor theory of value, which I just explained, that a certain product has value which is proportional to the amount of labor which goes into its production. And that was a mistake. Well, of course, he just summarized what people have, and these are deep thinkers now, people had thought before him. And since antiquity, that was uncontroversial, that the value of something is proportional to the amount of labor which goes into its production. Nothing could be more obvious than that, they said. And then, of course, the counterexamples cropped up, and it was Menger who pointed out that this is completely wrong, and you have to define value as the marginal utility. And too bad, because Karl Marx, when he was sitting in the British Museum library and looking at the literature, all the books, including Adam Smith, he hit on this idea, labor theory of value, wonderful, he said, and he developed a theory of exploitation, Karl Marx, in the 19th century, the first part, I think. And this theory of exploitation said that the owners of the means of production expropriate the surplus value which justly would belong to labor, because labor creates value. But by virtue of ownership of the means of production, the owners of capital just expropriate the surplus value, steal it in plain English, and this is unjust, and we've got to have a revolution, and proletariat would have to take over and make a clean sweep, expropriate the expropriators, and nationalize all means of production, and the great, the new brave world will come, and everybody will be happy ever after. Well, that was pure theory, And of course, Karl Marx was free to publish his great book on capital, Das Kapital, and then the Communist Manifesto and the others. But it was still theory. And then comes a man whose nom de guerre, the pseudonym, was Lenin, of course. And he was a man of action. He was not a man of theory so much, but he wanted to put the ideas of Marx into practice. And he did. He was instrumental in doing that. They called it the revolution, but it was really just a putsch, the German word putsch. What's the English equivalent?
Coup d'etat.
Yeah.
What's the French word?
Yeah. Well, that's a French word. There's no English word. Coup d'etat. Yeah. Taking over power, overthrowing the Tsar, and his. Oh no. There were stages, but that's not the interesting point. Is then Lenin was free to put his ideas into practice, and it cost literally hundreds of millions of lives to correct that mistake, and it took almost 75 years. The lifespan of the Soviet Union just fell short, a few months short of 75. Didn't reach the 75, but it was more than 74 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was an incredible thing, because the Soviet Union, well, nobody, not even the CIA, expected. Oh, sorry. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not expected. It was not. The Soviet Union looked all invincible. Had all the weaponry, all the machinery, had the satellites, had the rockets, everything. And yet it did collapse. And all those people who died, not just during the revolution, but afterwards, part of it was in the Gulag and the labor camps and so on, and the various follow-up wars, including the Korean and the Vietnam War, and etc., etc. Hundreds of millions of people died, and they died for nothing, because it was all a mistaken idea. Mistaken idea because of the theory of labor, theory of value. Everything was staked on that theory by Marx, and then Lenin put it in practice and so on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm suggesting it to you that today something very, very sinister is happening, which is very, very similar and reminds me of that historic mistake, which is that the economists today, and I mentioned two names, Keynes and Friedman, what they did, in spite of all their antagonism, which could have been genuine, could have been pretended, I don't know and I don't care, but in one thing they did agree, and the thing they agreed, Keynes and Friedman, was that the choice of gold as money is irrelevant. Gold is not a natural raw material out of which you can fashion the measuring rod with which you measure value. It's not. And then come the Lenins of today, the Bernankes, the Greenspans, and the rest of them, the central bankers, who put that theory into practice and force their rotten ideas on the rest of the people of the world. And I'm asking you, how many hundreds of millions of people will have to die? By the way, when I said Lenin, following Lenin, hundreds of million people died, I haven't mentioned specifically, but just think of those who died of starvation. The peasants in the Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union were forced into these the kolkhoz system. And they were very prosperous before, and they were deprived of their farms, and then they died of starvation. You know, not everybody died because of the firing squad. So many did, and so many died in the trenches, in the wars, and so on. But there are also innocent people, women and children, who died of starvation. And the same thing is going to happen. And who is responsible for that? The new Lenins, the Bernankes. These are revolutionaries. They overthrew the Constitution of the United States the same way as Lenin overthrew the Tsarist government. And as a consequence, they could grab the power, unlimited power, because the power to print money is an unlimited power. And if you think of it, you will realize that the important thing about the experiment of the United States, if I may call it that, it's much more than just an experiment. Very sad that eventually turned out to be, because it's not democracy, but it's limited government. That's the idea which the creation of the United States brought into the world. Limited government. And of course it was followed, and in many other countries the example, shining example of the United States was followed. And democracy is just a slogan, but limited government is a precise thing, and that was overthrown, and violently overthrown. And these guys, Bernanke and others, and you know the names, I don't have to repeat them, are enemies of humanity just the same as Lenin was and Stalin was. Just because they don't have machine guns, well, eventually it will come to, perhaps it will come to that. I don't want to make predictions about that. But the situation is very, very serious, and this is what is happening. It's a coercion being imposed on the world. Gold is the natural money, or the material out of which money is formed, and it has been overthrown by a coup d'etat, by a putsch. That's what it was, and as a consequence the world's population could be pushed into slavery through paper money. But we haven't seen the worst yet, because starvation is still ahead, and civil war is still ahead, complete breakdown of law and order, and this is very unfortunate. So I think I finish here, but you see the concept of marginal utility just blossoms, and it puts the picture in the right perspective. And I think it was necessary to go as far as I did here to point out the bleak future which is threatening us. So, I didn't leave any time, but if there are some quick questions, let's have them.
Does anyone have any quick questions? No, okay.
Well, there will be another chance. Okay.
Just one comment, Professor. Thank you for all this. I read a book about the Ukraine famine.
Yeah.
Very graphic description of bloated bodies and little babies and people eating each other's babies, and it was the most horrific. I've lived 65 years, and it's the most horrific thing I've ever heard about. I would suggest perhaps worse than the Nazi thing. So that Stalin-induced deliberate starvation, it's the worst thing in my imagination I can possibly imagine. That was hell on earth. So if this is where we have to go, then I want out of here.
No.
So, what is this book here?
Shall we break for them?
Yes, yes. Unless
Diego.
It would be a big black book of communism.
I have a question.
Death by government.
On the initial part of the two curves between the ask and the bid, I mean, the spread is large for small quantities because of transaction costs mostly.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. And if we said before that the marginal utility, the unit price of a good decreases with quantity, why does the ask curve slope upward towards the end?
Why does this slope upward?
Yes.
It's because the guy that sold it to you isn't sure. First of all, that's a very large quantity. The guy that sold it to you is not sure that he'll be able to replace what he's given to you at
I think, if
that
I
price.
interject, the comment the professor made yesterday would have been within that range. The consumer going to the store and buying, 50 pounds of coffee instead of 1 pound. This is, we're talking about in a commercial futures market, for example, where coffee might trade in 2-ton lots to begin with, but if you want to buy more than 100 tons is where the spread is starting to widen. So this is like 3 orders of magnitude larger quantities than I think what the professor was talking about yesterday.
Is that the way that you're meant to trade? You pick up the broker, you pick up the phone and you call the broker and you say, give me a quote in 100 tons. You don't tell him which way you're going to go. Give me a quote.
quotes the spread rather than the price.
Yeah, and he quotes a spread in 100 tons, and he doesn't know which way you're buying or whether you're buying or selling. And then you give your decision. So that's the way you should think about it, basically.
And we refine the idea of marketability. We go a little bit beyond Menger himself, because Menger kept talking about what we would call marketability in the large. But on the left, and I don't know if your question referred to that, the left is marketability in the small. Yeah. And we haven't touched this, but perhaps later during the session we will touch this also. Marketability in the small is also known as hoardability, and there will be a most hoardable good, and the most hoardable good leads to the idea of interest. But that's another story. Right here we were concentrating on the original idea of Menger. And what's the German word what Menger used? Please, one German word you have to learn absolutely in this session, and this is Absatzfähigkeit, right? Could you say it aloud so everybody gets the right pronunciation?
Absatzfähigkeit.
That's it. Write it down. That you must learn.
What does it mean?
Marketability in the large.
Okay.
But just one word, if you say marketability, that's what you mean. Absatz,
A with two dots above it.
H,
H-I-G-K-E-I-T.
And then
Now, I don't know if Menger created that word or that existed already in the German language. I don't know that. But perhaps somebody should look into that. Was Menger the first one to use that word, or did it already exist before him? I can't answer that question. But that's the one German word, and there are lots of others which